Thanks very much and welcome to this fourth session. And what we're looking at now is integrated food production systems. And as I understand it, this is what we're looking at will touch on some of the themes that have already been discussed earlier on this morning. And this essentially is how to combine sustainability with the pressure to keep increasing productivity and to meet the demands of rising populations and rising living standards, and not to become too divorced from the kind of issues that Sarah Mukherjee was talking about, the sorts of realities of people, day-to-day realities of people in places like Essex and Sao Paulo for that matter. Price matters, as well as the sort of green imperative. And I think one of the things that we'll look at is how to negotiate the sometimes very treacherous waters of green politics, in the sense that we're living in an era where political issues are very quickly ideologized. They're reduced to simple formulas, simple massively opposing propositions, and very often the answers are more complex and they're in between, and we'll look at some of those issues. And to help us find a way through this conundrum, or these conundrums really, John Starkey is going to kick us off. He's a lead on sustainable agricultural systems at Rothamsted Research, which focuses on these issues based in the UK. We're then going to move on to Vinicius Pereira Guimarães, who's head in Europe of an organisation that I always think of as being one of Brazil's best kept secrets, really, Embrapa, state formed, I think, in the 1970s, and has been brilliant at developing technologies that have helped Brazil do amazing things in its agricultural sector, but it's very little known outside Brazil, or relatively little known outside Brazil. Vinicius, in fact, is based in Montpellier in France, part of a big European network that I guess is trying to correct that. And then we have David Cleary, who's Director of Global Agriculture at Nature Conservancy, and he is a specialist on Brazil. So we're moving from the broad to the specific of Brazil, and then we'll finish off with Fernando Sampaio. And Fernando is from, he certainly lives at the moment in Mato Grosso, which is the heartland of Brazil's soya industry. And he is the executive director of a program which was launched in 2015 and brings together the Mato Grosso state authorities with the private sector, with civil society, and it's called, self-explanatory, Produce, Conserve, Include strategy. So that's apparently it's a fairly unique example of a state-led initiative in Brazil. There's one or two things that are about. Fernando, I'm sure, will tell us more. So each of the speakers is going to talk for about 10 minutes, and then we'll should have some time for questions before we round up about 3:15.
Okay.
All right. Go on, John.
Okay, so thank you very much. Thank you again for the invitation to speak, and thanks for coming back after lunch. I'll put my cards on the table. So I'm an agroecologist, and I work at Rothamsted Research, which is an institute about 20 miles north of here in Harpenden. We work on a range of things that are relevant to the discussion today, crop protection, crop improvement, and most importantly to this session, designing sustainable agricultural systems. So I'm coming very much from the supply side of the equation, not thinking about diet or consumer behaviour or markets, but thinking about how farmers manage their land sustainably. Most of my work is in Northwest Europe. I've got one project in Africa at the moment, but I hope what I've got to say, the principles I'm talking about are generic and are applicable to whatever farming system we're working in. The topic this afternoon is integrated farming systems. So as Richard said, how do we bring together the various needs and requirements of different stakeholders have on a parcel of land and do that in a way that's sustainable, both economically, environmentally, and socially. And to do that, in terms of looking forward to where we want to get to, it's useful, first of all, to think about how we got to where we are now. Our current large-scale industrial agriculture systems, whether that be soya production in Brazil or winter wheat production in the UK, how did we get to where we are now? And right at the beginning of today, we rightly celebrated the achievements of the Green Revolution. In your handout, you've got that graph of increasing soy yields and increasing grain yields, which have pretty much tripled over the last 4 or 5 decades and have kept pace with increasing populations and improving diets. And that green revolution has been driven by 3 main things. One is mechanisation, the invention of the tractor, and I could include the Haber-Bosch process in there as well, increased use of fossil fuels and industrialisation of agriculture. The second big component has been crop breeding and high-yielding modern varieties. So we had Norman Borlaug already mentioned. He was one of the architects of the Green Revolution in breeding short-strawed varieties of cereals and rice, which had this high harvest index, so you could increase yields by sometimes three times. And then the third aspect of the Green Revolution, which we thought of before lunch, was the innovation around crop protection and pesticides, herbicides, and insecticides and the like. And those 3 things have come together to result in the large-scale systems that we have now. So interestingly, Chris mentioned this gap before lunch, and saying that our systems are poorly prepared for a change in the legislative environment around pesticides and active ingredients. That's because those systems have been built around those active ingredients. The most extreme example is Roundup Ready systems in the US or South America, where the very crop you grow is tied to the chemistry and the active ingredient. So those are the drives, if you like, how we've got to where we are, the components of the Green Revolution. And what has that resulted in? It's resulted in large-scale systems. It's resulted in homogeneous systems. So we grow, as we mentioned before, a relatively small range of crops on large acreages. And it's led to the fact that farmers' cropping decisions are largely driven by market concerns and business. What's the most profitable crop I can grow this year? That's my primary criteria. What fertilisers do I need? What crop protection products do I need to support that crop? So that's the paradigm that we're in the moment, and it's been incredibly successful, as we've already said and celebrated how agricultural science and our community has kept pace with the demands of society. The other benefit of that is it's led to this land-sparing paradigm that we were talking about right at the start. If we can intensify those parcels of land that we grow the crops on, it means that we can spare more land for pristine habitat. And there's now a growing literature and consensus in the literature that says for environments like Brazil, with these mature, pristine habitats like the Amazon, a land-sparing paradigm is the optimal one for reconciling productivity with biodiversity, as opposed to a land-sharing paradigm. So they're all kind of the upside, if you like, and the benefits of the Green Revolution and how we've got to where we are now. But increasingly, certainly within the systems that I work in, and I know also in the North American prairies around glyphosate-resistant weeds, there are starting to be some stress fractures appearing in those systems and in that Green Revolution. So in the same way that if you're a runner or you're a bowler in cricket and you do the same action again and again and again, you run the risk of developing stress fractures. So you're doing the same action again and again. We're starting to see problems with repeating these very simple input-based systems on a large scale. And I've got 3 of those stress fractures. One of them has been mentioned already, and that's a problem of pesticide resistance. So we're in this accelerating arms race where we develop a new product, a new active ingredient. All the farmers jump on board and use it. Glyphosate is a classic example. If we've got the GMOs, everybody can use glyphosate. Then the organisms that are targeted very quickly develop resistance, and then you have to get on to the next active ingredient. And so you're on this treadmill. And what's happening is the pest, weeds, and diseases are evolving resistance more quickly, and we're developing the active ingredients more slowly. So that is fundamentally unsustainable. The second stress factor is soil health. So we talked a lot about carbon, and we talked about forestry and agroforestry offsetting carbon so that the trees can take up the carbon that perhaps we're losing from the agricultural land. Increasingly, we realise for soil health, you need a lot of that carbon in your agricultural soil that you're growing your crops on to have resilient soils in terms of droughts and water holding capacity, and resilient and stable yields. And certainly in the UK, there's a very strong emphasis now on improving soil health, and soil organic matter, soil carbon, is a big part of that. The third stress factor is around functional biodiversity, and I emphasise the word functional. We all know about the extinction crisis that we've been hearing about in terms of overall wildlife losses, but there is a specific issue in agriculture of losing the biodiversity that delivers something to productivity. It might be the pollinators, it might be the beneficial insects that regulate the pest populations, it might be the macrofauna in the soil, the functional component of the biodiversity that supports and underpins agriculture. The buzzword is ecosystem services and natural capital, but we've consistently eroded that over the past 4 or 5 decades as productivity has gone up, and we're starting now to hit a ceiling. And some of these things we think are explaining the plateauing of yields. So your graph of soya and your graph of grain yields, it can't keep going up. It will reach a plateau, it will reach a ceiling. So how much does looking after the environment and looking after ecosystem services have to contribute to that? I could add a third one, which was the issue of pesticide residues in food and in water and in the general environment, which again creates this pressure against the existing paradigm. So that's kind of where we got to where we are. Some of the benefits of it, the huge benefits, but some of the issues and some of these what people call negative externalities associated with that system. So what do we do? What are the alternative trajectories? How do we counter that? I think there are 3 options. One is business as usual, and one is that we stick with the cropping systems that we've got, soya, corn, winter wheat, canola, and find specific solutions to the problems as they come up. So in the UK, it's a weed called blackgrass, which is our main problem. Let's just find another herbicide, or let's use gene drive or something else to control that pest. And that locks you in to the existing paradigm. It says we're going to stay with our industrialised, input-based, large-scale, homogeneous systems and hope that biotech will be our saviour. That's one option. The next option is to extensify. And there's been some talk about this already, about reducing inputs and going back to a more heterogeneous landscape like it used to be 30, 40 years ago. Perhaps organic is part of that solution. There's certainly a part for that. But again, if you look at the literature, there again is a consensus that some of the negative externalities around agriculture, if you measure them on a per unit of product basis, so per kilogram of beef or a ton of wheat, those negative externalities are higher in extensified systems. So if you want to challenge me about that afterwards, I can try and explain and point you to a couple of papers that make that point. So given that we can't keep going on as we are, and given that extensification is not a sustainable solution, there has to be a third way. And the third way is the integrated systems that we're going to be talking about this afternoon. That again, the buzzword is sustainable intensification. I'm not a huge fan of that term, but it serves a purpose. And within that, there's an acknowledgement that it isn't a single way of farming, like organic versus conventional, but it integrates lots of different approaches, and it integrates the biotechnology with a more ecological way of farming that we were thinking about this morning. And to finish, I'm just going to suggest 2 overriding principles that should underpin sustainable intensification. The first is there should be a rediversification of systems in space and in time. So that means we need to be growing more crops in our rotations, And it also means that we need to be integrating semi-natural habitats into our agricultural landscapes at a finer scale. So it's not good enough to have a whole region dedicated to soy or a whole region dedicated to winter wheat and put your biodiversity somewhere completely different. There is an interaction between the two, and you need some functional biodiversity in the landscape. So that's the first one, rediversifying systems in space and time. The second one is tightening up nutrient cycles. So one of the products of the Green Revolution is we've got these very open, leaky systems. We put lots of inputs on, so there's an estimate that of the nitrogen fertiliser that goes on fields, 30% finds its way into the grain. Where does the rest of it go? We've got very open, leaky systems, and we need to be working on tightening up those nitrogen cycles such that we are losing less and we're storing more for tomorrow. And with that, I'm going to stop, Richard.
Thanks very much, John. Excellent introduction. And Vinicius.
Okay. So first of all, I'd like to thank the invitation from the Brazilian Embassy, and also thanks Dr. Richard for the fantastic introduction. We have this topic is really important. It's an honor to be here to talk about that because Embrapa is working on that for a very long time. We are talking about the integrated systems of food production, but I have two very good questions to ask for you first, so I can develop the way until the end of my presentation. How we can feed more than 8 million starving people in the world? This is the first question. Very complex and complicated question. And considering that we have 1/3 of food waste. The second question is how can we double our food production until 2050? Well, the answer is quite simple, and I guess everybody already has it. We just have to produce more food. It's not there. It's not there, but we have just to produce more food. Unfortunately, it's not that easy. Actually, the answer is easy, but we have to produce in a sustainable way. This is what John just told us. How can we do it in a sustainable way? Well, I guess my predecessors, they were talking very much about science, technology, and innovation. This is the only way we can get through this very big challenge, not only for undeveloped countries or developed countries. It's a very huge problem for everybody, for the world. And Celso Moretti, during the beginning of his presentation this morning, he was saying that how science and technology can change and transform a country that were at the first beginning importing food in now one of the biggest country that produce food not only for internal consumption but also for external. Well, we have a big challenge. Well, you can think, Brazil, we have very good climate, very nice condition, and I like very much this picture because it looks or it shows a little bit how difficult it is to produce in this very complex and diverse ecological situation, diverse climate situation. But even with this huge country, we are able to produce in a sustainable way. And of course, we have, this is a bit complex, and I know that sometimes those numbers can shock and can give us a very nice talk, but we are able, even being one of the biggest producers in the world, we are able to preserve or to keep more than 66% of our native vegetation. We are using 30% of our land to produce, to crop, to produce meat. And one very important thing is that in those 30% we are using of the land, we still have space to improve because 2/3 of this land, we still have low or medium productivity. So we still have space not to open new lands. We don't have to do that, at least for the next few years, but we can, using science and technology, we can improve this capacity, the capacity to produce more and more quality. And talking about the integrated systems, what we are looking for is for sustainability, as John just told us. We want to optimize the natural resources. We have to use better the waste management, conservation of biodiversity, again, and diversified needs for the rural communities. Well, those topics are very interesting, but to put them together, we have a very known solution in Brazil, what we call ILPF, or Integrated Crop, Livestock, and Forest Systems. This system has been developing in Brazil for the past several years. Now we have very much knowledge about that, and of course, we still have space to improve. But the main idea here is diversification. What we have here, it's a very complex system, but we are taking care about trees, about grass, about animals. So we have a diversification of the production. And we are disseminating also conservative practices. If you remember the Celso Moretti's talk today, this morning, we are saving more than $3 billion just using this, the non-tillage and also the biological fixation of nitrogen. We are saving lots of money with these technologies, with those technologies. We can optimize and intensify soil nutrient cycling. Well, I'm glad to be saying things that John already started, and just proving that this is the only way we can get to the sustainable production. So here we have some sustainable practices to allow intensive farming in most part of the country. We used to have Cerrado was supposed not to produce anything, and now we are one of the best producers in many crops using the Cerrado land. Fernando will talk about a little bit. Mato Grosso is one of the best states that produce crops in Brazil and also other products. And we are talking about crops, wood and trees, but we have some parameters about animal health, welfare. So we are combining very different traits, very different characteristics in the same area. We are combining them. We are trying to get what is the best from them, and also trying to put that in a very sustainable way. I don't know if you have seen those pictures before, but the idea, and it's very nice when you go there, you see how things are working, and you see the animals, you see that everything works perfectly. The maintenance of the biodiversity, which is really important. The flexibility to be adapted to different productive areas. So you don't have to use only, of course, soybeans they are very important for the external market, but we can use that in a very large crop situations. And we can increase, of course, using those integrated systems, the production of grain, because of all the interactions we have, fiber, meat, milk, timber and non-timber products. And we are gaining greater efficiency of the use of those resources, which is, you can see it's the producer, I guess we had this talk already, they want to make money. Of course, they want to preserve, they want to keep going on that with this, with the farming system, but they need to make money. And the reduction of the seasonality of labor and pressure for new areas. As I told you before, we have the opportunity to just improving the capacity of our, the greater the land we have, or also the land that there's not the productivity, a very nice productivity yet. We can, using this type of integrated system, we can improve very much our production without open new areas. And we have been testing and validating many different types of integrated systems in Brazil. And we came, Dr. Celso told us this morning also about the the carbon neutral Brazilian beef, which is consequence from all this integrated system, producing a very good meat quality, producing a certified low carbon production system. So we can also meet a market requirement, but we also can have a very sustainable way to produce those products. And I'm finishing, and we have to think that the role of the agriculture, it's changing, and it's changing in a way that we have to have the production of the raw materials. It's really important. That's not on the discussion. We have to produce the food, we have to have employment, we have to have income. Well, okay, but now we have to have those things, but thinking more about supply of renewable energy. We have to think more about supplying biological inputs. We have to think about landscape care, climate regulation, wildlife and flora conservation, carbon sequestration, producing biomass, and organic matter in the soils. Organic matter in the soils will be one of the next subjects we will have to discuss very much. And we already have very nice results on that, but this is one of the biggest challenges we have now, organic matter in the soils. And to finish, we can produce in compliance with these requirements. This is a market requirements. This is the world requirements. But someone who doesn't want to follow those requirements probably will have to take the risk of losing competitiveness or having their products depreciated in the market. So it's still an option. It's still an option. You don't have to make all those things. But the ones they are making, the ones they are producing using the science, the technology, the innovation we already have, that's why it's so important. And that's why I guess I'm sure that we'll keep being a very a country with a very nice and sustainable production for a long time. Thank you very much.
This one's just David.
First, I'd like to thank the Embassy for the invitation. And I'd also like to recommend we do these meetings more than once a year. All of the topics that each of the panels have dealt with are complicated in themselves, difficult to really dive into them, especially in 10 minutes, especially in a country the size of Brazil. So I think if I'm going to address this question, there's two preliminary things I have to say. And then I'm going to do a quick helicopter tour of Brazil in terms of integrated production systems. And I'm going to try and bounce back and address a couple of the points that John raised at the beginning. Then hand over to Fernando, who's going to give you more of a hover over Mato Grosso. So the first thing to say is that Brazil is a really big country. When you're talking about production systems and the integrated production systems, they vary a great deal by region. You've basically got 3 regions. You can break them down into sub-regions, but the 3 major regions you can talk about are the Amazon, the Cerrado, and southern Brazil. They've all got very different types of production systems, and the history of them all is quite different. They raise different issues on the sustainability front as well. The second point I'd like to raise is when you're talking about integrated systems, you've got to talk at both a farm and a landscape level. And sometimes those two are not going to be marching in sync. You're going to have stuff happening at a farm level, even at quite a high scale at farm level, that's not necessarily going to be driving landscape level change, because landscape level change gets driven by markets and commodity demand and those kind of things. So you can get a lot of interesting things happening at a local level, but that's not necessarily the dominant force of land use change at the landscape level, and that's really important to bear in mind. So having said all of that, quick helicopter tour, starting out with the Amazon. The Amazon is actually where you're going to find, probably in spatial terms, more integrated farming systems than anywhere else. And that's because of its tradition of agroforestry products. Virgilio talked about that a little bit in the beginning of the morning. The really interesting story about the Amazon is actually, he mentioned acai. Acai is a brilliant example of how things happen completely by accident, but they turn out to be really important in landscape history. So acai is a local Amazonian product. It's been in the state of Pará an absolute staple for a long time. Over the last 30 years, for reasons which nobody can really explain, it became an international commodity. If you broke out, there was no government plan behind it, there was no sort of brilliant inspired project by an NGO. It happened because of cultural change and a shifting dietary pattern. And if you wanted to break out, like, what is the largest, in spatial terms, integrated production system anywhere in Brazil, it's acai, because acai farmers typically produce a range of different products, and acai is both a subsistence and a cash product that actually drives that system. And especially in areas like the delta of the Amazon, the floodplains of the Amazon, you're going to find integrated production systems all over the place, just based around agroforestry products in combination with agriculture products. That's one part of the Amazon, but there's another part of the Amazon, which is the part that's in the news, which is the agricultural frontiers. Now there, what's driving change is ranching. It's not soy, as Andrea actually explained pretty well in the morning. Cropland is actually expanding over cleared land in the Amazon. It's a very different situation from the Cerrado, where the scale of production is much greater. But to an extent, even amidst all the sort of terrible news about deforestation and stuff, where you find cropland expanding over cleared land, and you do find that in certain parts of the Amazon, at a landscape level at least, that's what success looks like. You're having cropland expanding not into forest, but over cleared land. Your problem is that the ranching is expanding into forest. And so, at a landscape level, that's negative. When you go to the Cerrado, the situation is really different. So the Cerrado is, beef and soy are the dominant forces of what's driving the agricultural economy of the Cerrado. Now, I've listened to what people have said about different agricultural models and the agroecological model and so forth. The reality of beef and soy is that the beef market is primarily domestic Brazilian. There's a growing export market for beef, which is places like the Middle East, Russia, Venezuela. None of them are markets that environmental or sustainability concerns are going to be a factor. Soy, I don't hate to break it to the UK and the EU. You're sort of important in the soy market, but you're much less important than China. China's what's really driving change there, and all of the projections, if you look about what's going to happen in the next 10, 20 years, China is already the dominant player in the soy market. It's going to be even more dominant. So these large-scale agricultural enterprises that you see in the Sahara, you're going to see more of those. You might deplore the fact, but the economic realities are what they are. And so the really critical question for those types of enterprises is, can we have the cropland expanding over cleared land in the Sahara? Because that's what's going to preserve biodiversity and ecosystem services at a landscape level. Plus, are there ways that we can take some of the principles of agroecology, especially around pest control, which I think is the major problem for the Sahara, but also soil health as well. And I'll address that a little bit in a minute. And then finally, I think you have, in southern Brazil, a really interesting sort of rather old historically, it's complex, especially in the extreme southern states, Santa Catarina, Paraná, Rio Grande do Sul. Those are basically the descendants of European family farmers. They're medium-sized producers to this day. You have a lot of integrated production systems already. You have quite diverse systems there, sophisticated farmers, even though they're not big farmers. And a lot of, I would say, the great work that Embrapa is doing around ILPF as well. I think, personally, the southern Brazil is probably where you're going to find most scope for that kind of thing. I know that the ambitions are to do it much more in the north and in the Sahara. My fear is that we can talk about this perhaps, that the extension support that they require, the training that they need for farmers, because these are like unfamiliar systems for the most part. They haven't evolved organically. They're sort of being thought about by clever people in excellent institutions like Embrapa. Well, spreading those across the landscape is a complicated and long-term thing. And I think probably the best conditions for you to be able to do that are in southern Brazil, although by all means, the more we can see of that in the Sahara and the Amazon, the better. The final thing, I'd like to come back to the question of the principles which John raised at the beginning, which I think are really important. And when we're thinking about the sustainability of Brazilian agriculture in the future, they're absolutely critical. And I think these are questions that are more relevant for the Sahara than for anywhere else, and more critical that we solve them in the Sahara compared to anywhere else. I would say roughly on the functional biodiversity front, Brazil's doing pretty well. And the reason for that, as has been cited a couple of times, is Brazil has excellent environmental legislation for farmers, the Forest Code, the fact that you've got the legal reserve, and the fact you've also got a really interesting sort of piece of legislation that also protects things called APPs, areas of particular protection, sort of like translating it. Those are areas which are regarded above and beyond the areas of native habitat that you have to conserve. Areas within a farm that are particularly important for ecosystem services. Vegetation on land that's over a certain gradient. I don't even know the English for it, but the vegetation on the side of streams,
Buffer strips.
Buffer strips,
yeah.
Right. You're obliged to preserve those. And the result of that, and compliance is fairly reasonable, the result of that is you've got pretty excellent levels of functional biodiversity in most Brazilian farms. The problem is around soil health and around pesticides. Brazil's a tropical, I think pesticides is the most important problem. Brazil's a tropical country. It's extremely biodiverse, and that's reflected in its pest biota. It's got lots of pests. They're incredibly biodiverse. They breed really quickly because of the temperatures. As the sort of soy beef complex grows in the Sahara, as it will, I think the pesticide problem is going to be a real issue, and it's already, I think, being engaged with by Brazilian, agribusiness and Brazilian farmers. But it's going to be a problem, and it's not like deforestation where it's an immediately visible problem that you read about in the newspapers. It's a sort of incremental, slow problem that is going to get worse and worse unless something happens. And I think how to manage that is one of the most interesting conversations around the future of Brazilian agriculture. Soil health, finally. I think the mark in the Sahara is actually not bad in some ways. You've got very high levels of no-till farming. You've got very good use on the whole of crop residues and root systems in the soil. You've got, especially in the soy sector, farmers who are very knowledgeable about soil health issues. But the reality is that the scale of soy production is so great, and you've got issues with, especially expanding over pasture land, you've got issues with soil compaction. There's still, I think, a lot more to be done around guaranteeing soil health in the Sahara into the future. And again, it's like pesticides. It's one of those not very visible, incremental sort of problems which don't get a lot of media attention but are really, really, really important. So I'll stop there for now.
Fernando.
Thank you. Well, thanks again to the Embassy and Apex Brazil for the invitation. Actually, I'm glad I'm the last one because I can, tell a little bit of how everything we discussed today can actually connect to the reality in a given territory inside Brazil. So I'm going to talk about this initiative from the state of Mato Grosso. It's called Produce, Conserve, Include. And just to give some information about Mato Grosso, we are the biggest producers in Brazil of soy, cotton, corn, beef. A lot of these commodities come out of Mato Grosso. It's the biggest producer among the Brazilian states. And Mato Grosso is about the size of France and Germany put together. And what we have in forests is about the size of France. So it's 63% of the entire territory of Mato Grosso. And the rest is used for pastures and agriculture. And we did have a very significant achievement of reducing deforestation in the past decades, at the same time increasing production of grains and beef in the state of Mato Grosso. And that reduction in deforestation is related to a lot of public and private policies combined. But at the same time, we still have a lot of challenges to overcome. Deforestation is still at 1,500 square kilometers a year. We have about 125,000 families of smallholders inside Mato Grosso. Many of them live in poverty. And these people, they occupy like 15% of the land, but they are responsible for 60% of the occupation, labor occupation on the rural areas of Mato Grosso. We have 43 different ethnic groups of indigenous people in Mato Grosso. Half of the state GDP comes only from 11 municipalities. We have 141 municipalities in Mato Grosso. So the production of income is not, like I say, it's very unequal inside the state of Mato Grosso. So we still have a lot of challenges. And these challenges, they triggered the creation of the PCI strategy back in 2015 because we had all the world negotiations on climate going on before Paris. The civil society saw an opportunity to take this agenda forward in Mato Grosso and wanted to establish, a commitment to stop deforestation inside Mato Grosso. At the same time, the producers are saying the world demand is growing. We have an opportunity to develop the state. So how we combine all these different things, and that's when we saw that this was possible. And then the PCI was born with this long-term vision for the state of Mato Grosso. Yes, we can produce more, we can conserve the environmental assets that we have, and we can include these smallholders and traditional populations on this development process. And just to give an idea about the opportunities that we are talking about, you'll see on this map, the red dots there are all the areas that today are pasture but are highly suitable for agriculture. When you take the last report of Rabobank, was recently released, and they are forecasting what is going to be the world demand for soy, for example, what they are saying is that we are going to need about 9 million hectares more of soy in the next 10 years to fulfill all the world demand. In Brazil, 70% of this growing demand will come from Brazil, according to this paper. And, 9 million hectares can fit inside Mato Grosso pastures. We have 15 million hectares of pastures with low productivity that can be transformed in agriculture. And we still are not losing beef production because we can intensify beef production and we can double the beef production that we have today. So there's a huge opportunity. We can actually meet the world demand. At the same time, we can conserve the forests that we have. and help the producers to be compliant with all international requirements that are coming from the private sector. So the PCI was born with this vision. We can provide sustainable development for the state of Mato Grosso. We can help producers to have this opportunity in the market, at the same time to fulfill the commitments that they have to the private sector, and at the same time create opportunities for this family. Mato Grosso is exporting a lot of commodities, but we are importing things like fruits and vegetables from other states in Brazil. So there are opportunities for the smallholders on the local market in Mato Grosso to be developed also. And this vision, this long-term vision, it resumes in a set of targets, specific targets, 21 targets actually, to be more exact, that we can measure and see how progress is being made. So this is what we call a jurisdictional initiative. The PCI is not an initiative from the state, the government of Mato Grosso. It puts together the government, the civil society, the private sector, because we understand that none of this can solve the problems alone. We have to join forces of these different actors to have solutions. So we have put together some elements of this landscape or jurisdictional approach. We have this multi-stakeholder coalition. We have governance in place. We have this shared vision and the targets to orient the work of these actors. We are monitoring those targets. We have a strategic planning about priority actions that have to take in place on financial mechanisms, on land tenure issues, on environmental regularization, innovation. So we have actions, and these are not words only. So we have real concrete actions taking place in Mato Grosso. We have a plan to control deforestation. We just invest millions of dollars in a new satellite system that can detect deforestation every 2 days. And we can see where it's happening and even prevent deforestation before it happens. We have conducted a process of consultation with all the different indigenous groups in Mato Grosso. We have a plan to develop family farming. So all these actions are taking place and we are monitoring. And for the last piece, we are creating an investment structure because, all of this needs investments. We are talking about recovering degraded areas, intensifying cattle production. We are talking about, forest code compliance. We still have a lot of farmers that have to catch up just to be compliant with the regulation of the forest code. And we need investments in forest restoration. We need investments in technical assistance, for example. So we are creating this structure where we can drive investments to the right places in Mato Grosso. And we do have a lot of partnerships that are already going on. We have private funds that are investing, for example, in intensification for sustainable livestock. We have investments on land tenure, for example, from the Amazon Fund. We have investments from the UK and Germany through the Red Early Movers program. So we are also transforming the reduction of deforestation, the carbon credits of that, in investments to address all the challenges that we have, and partnerships with private companies. Companies that are buying beef and soy every year, we are telling them that, we need to build this forest positive future, and we cannot build this on sanctions and embargoes. We need to build this on partnership. So we are telling these companies that they have to engage in this jurisdiction. First of all, buy your stuff in the places that are trying to do the right thing. And instead of avoiding the risk, help us to transform that. And the idea is that I'm not only working with sustainable soy or sustainable beef, but with the sustainability of an entire state the size of Mato Grosso. So we are helping to reduce the risk that these companies have on their supply chains today. And the idea is that they help us to make the right investments and drive this transition in the state. So we do have a lot of partnerships going on, including partnerships with the UK government and the German government. And I think that's the like I said, we are also talking to the private companies. We produced this publication where we have a lot of initiatives going on in the state of Mato Grosso on sustainable soy production, on sustainable cattle production, that companies can just plug and play and support these initiatives to get scale and to really transform this region. So we do have a couple of these available in the back of the room if you're interested. But that's an innovative example how you can put all these actors together to build this sustainable future. So thank you very much.
Fernando, thank you. I'm afraid through my extremely inefficient moderating, we have about less than 5 minutes for questions. But each of those presentations I thought was incredibly focused, and it was impossible to stop, and I think it would have been counterproductive to stop it. But there is maybe as I say, 5 minutes for questions. Yes, so 2 at the front. Maybe we could just take them both and then.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all the speakers for very interesting and complementary talks. My question is for the second speaker, Dr. Virgilio.
Vinicius.
Vinicius, sorry. So you presented on ELPF and you put the emphasis on how this constitutes an example of diversification in farming systems. The photos that are usually shown to represent ELPF are normally very similar to one another in terms of the types of crops, trees and animals that are presented. So my question is whether this system is applicable across different scales of production to different types of farming systems, and whether it is possible to connect the sort of concerns that ELPF has in terms of productivity and resource sustainability with other concerns connected to preservation of biodiversity and social concerns as well. Mm-hmm. So my question is whether is this really a new paradigm, or is it just a case of old wine in new bottles?
Oh, thank you. I just found it interesting, the concept of zero carbon beef. I wonder if you could explain, I think Fernando had in its presentation here.
Yeah, I did.
Oh, thank you. How this zero carbon beef in Brazil would compare, for instance, the carbon footprint of other countries. Thank you.
Okay.
So Vinicius, do you want to take those 2 questions, and then I think
sure.
we better close up the session.
I can address them. So the first one, I would like to, we had a very nice experience in one of the, what we call agro-silvopastoral system in the northeast of Brazil. So there we have a little bit similar what we just said about our forest code. We have to preserve 20% of the land. We have to 60% of the land we can use for crops, and the other 20% we can use for livestock. So it's an example that we can. The pictures I showed, they were pretty much from the same situation for the ELPF, but we have other systems that we can use even in the northeast of Brazil, which is also a semi-arid condition. So we are not talking about only in Cerrado land, or also we are talking about in Mato Grosso do Sul. We are talking in others very diversified conditions, and this is a semi-arid condition. And we can, when we do that, we are trying to work on the cycling, we are trying to work in the carbon, in nitrogen fixation. We are trying to work with all those characteristics. So I understood your tricky question, but yes, we can use that in many other places. This is not only in the place I just shown. And addressing your question, we are using the trees. We are using to capture the carbon. We have the methane. The animals. The big discussion of the use of the animals are the methane liberation. So when we balance that, we can create a system that will have the meat as a product with a carbon neutral production. So this is a question of balancing those characteristics, and at the end we can assure. Now, of course, it's a proven concept that we have a beef carbon neutral.
Vinicius, thanks very much. And thanks to all the speakers who joined me in thanking them. I think it's been a very, very interesting, enlightening session. I'm sure we could go on. There's an important session to come immediately, so thank you very much.